Hi, my name's Rob Hopkins from Transition Network, and it's a real delight to have been asked to join you today and to say a few words. I'm speaking to you here from Totnes in Devon, which is one of the places where transition really started and started to gain some kind of momentum. So I want to sort of share a few thoughts from here, which hopefully might be of use. And I was asked to say a few things about permaculture as well. But I suppose, there may well be some people in the room today who don't really know what transition is, so which is entirely reasonable. I suppose just to give a crash course introduction, I think transition is really about how do we create a healthy human culture, rooted in a place, driven by the people of that place, who choose to respond to the challenges that we face at this pivotal time in history with compassion, with creativity, with ingenuity, and who see the solutions as lying in bringing people closer together rather than fragmenting people further apart. In practice, what it looks like on the ground is community-led action, is a very practical response, which is about building a new economy from the ground up, new food enterprises, new local currencies, for example, different ways of looking at our economy in different ways, new ways of connecting people to food, community energy projects, that kind of stuff. And it's really at the same time aware of the fact that this is not just an outer process, that what needs to happen is not just about carrots and solar panels, but it's also an inner process. We need to be looking at how we look after each other, how we try to reduce burnout, how we give our groups the best likelihood that they're going to last for a long period of time. So my background was really in permaculture. I was a permaculture teacher for a long time. Permaculture is very useful thing to bring to transition, and in some ways I think of transition as being a kind of an evolution of permaculture. In that, so permaculture is really a design system. I like to think of it as the design glue that you need to stick together all the different elements that make up a sustainable human culture. And so I spent many years teaching that, teach people to grow their own food, build their own buildings, generate their own energy, all that kind of stuff. And so for me, transition is it's a bit like a Trojan horse, because quite often the thing with permaculture is if somebody stops you in the pub and says, "Rob, what's permaculture?" It's quite a tricky one to do without getting out a flip chart and drawing chickens and compost heaps and little arrows going round. It's quite a complex idea, whereas actually transition, people just go, "Oh yeah, it's transition." And so you kind of wheel the sort of transition Trojan horse past people that's got permaculture stuffed into it, and people go, "Oh yes, it's transition." But actually, very often, when people have been involved in transition for a while, even if they don't have a background particularly in permaculture, they kind of implicitly get to feel very familiar with those principles. So for me, permaculture is the most amazingly insightful set of principles in terms of how you create a kind of sustainable human culture. But as a movement, it seemed very small and quite happy to be quite small. And I got really frustrated saying, well, where are the people who are the really professional permaculture designers tendering for public parks, tendering for public spaces? How do we really scale this up? So transition kind of attempts to be that, I think. It attempts to be that vehicle for taking these ideas and scaling them up. And I think what we're starting to see is that in practice now happening, because transition is designed very much to come in underneath the radar. It's not a political thing, certainly not in a party political sense. I mean, inherently it's deeply political, but it's not tied to the left or to the right. It's not tied to sort of pro-capitalist, anti-capitalist, pro-growth, anti-growth. It sort of comes in underneath the radar in that sense, which is one of its great strengths, I think. In terms of how transition is relevant to Calgary and to Alberta, I've never been. Actually, I did go when I was 10, but I can't remember very much about it. So I don't really know. I mean, I know that you're under huge pressure from the expansion of fossil fuel development. And I think what transition can do that's helpful is to give another story. We've got the the Australian and the Canadian Prime Ministers getting together to try and derail international climate negotiations and to argue that actually economic growth is more important than climate, which is insane. And I think what transition can do is it can offer another story. It can offer a different story. It can not just come up with a theoretical argument that that the future is best served by doing things in a different way, but it can actually start doing that on the ground. It can start not waiting for permission from anybody. It can just start putting that in place. It can start putting in place the community energy models. It can start putting in place the local currencies, the different way of looking at local economies. And I think that argument now that transition is a form of economic development is really gaining in weight and gravity, and Transition Network has done some economic blueprints for a few places here which make that case really strongly and say actually transition is a form of economic development. Looking at the economy of the place where you live as being like a leaky bucket with the money pouring out through all the holes and saying how can we actually plug those leaks so the money cycles more locally is a form of economic development. And is one that can still create livelihoods, can still create jobs, can build rather than undermine community resilience, but is also appropriate to a world that would like to stay below 2 degrees and still have a stable climate. So I think transition has a really powerful role to play there. It's fun, it's creative, it's engaging, it inspires people. People can start to see change happening around them. It gives people an alternative way to invest money that they would otherwise be investing in the fossil fuel economy. They can divest from that and invest it into community energy companies, into community food businesses, all kinds of different local enterprises. So for me, there's a different story there, and it's a story that when we can articulate it well is much more inspiring than the idea that we just carry on with business as usual and leave the mess, the waste and the trashed biosphere for future generations who will somehow magically be so much cleverer than us that they'll be able to work all of that out, and they'll be really grateful for the fact that we chose inaction and actually making the problem worse rather than doing something about it. That's not something that I choose to put my energy to. I want to put my energy, and people in transition initiatives now in nearly 50 countries around the world, in thousands of places, are actually deciding they want to be what makes this change happen. They want to model this change in practice. So transition is a fantastic way of bringing people together in your community. There are lots of really good tools there for very creative events, for really engaging people in a way that they've often never been engaged with before, inviting people to be part of making history in a way that has never really been done before. You know, I often say, if we actually manage to do what needs to be done over these next 5, 10, 15 years, it'll have been such an extraordinary achievement that our grandchildren will tell great tales and sing great songs about what we did during this time. And I really would like to be able to be here to hear those, although there's no guarantee of that, and that's not why we do this stuff. But I think what you'll find in transition is something that's a really great way of bringing people together, creating a space to explore a different way of doing things, and a permission to just get on and do it. And I don't think that there's any more important work that we can be doing really at this time. And there's a question about when you're faced with really awful, undesirable development like tar sands, like gas fracking, like these kind of scraping of the barrel of the oil age and scraping what will tip us over in terms of climate change. We have a choice, I think. Do we campaign and lobby and protest and try and put ourselves in the way, or actually do we try and build the alternative? Do we try and build the community energy, the renewable energy infrastructure, and try and do that? And which of those two is the most radical? And which of those two is the most political? And I think that's a really interesting question. So I hope you have really, really good discussions and really good deliberation. I hope when you look at it, you'll find that within transition there's something really powerful and something really useful that can help. And it would be so brilliant if in 5 or 10 years actually the story that people around the world tell about Calgary and about Alberta isn't about the tar sands and it being the kind of last bastion of fossil fuel extraction, but that actually what people are able to say is that it's the place that where the people decided they wanted to tell a different story. And they didn't wait for anyone's permission, they just got on with it. And they started to model in practice what the kind of economy, what the kind of energy infrastructure that they wanted to see happened. And I know that sounds terribly kind of blasé, and actually that's a huge task, but that's the task of our times. And we here at Transition Network are ready to be helpful in whatever way we can, and there's lots of resources to help you. And we stand ready to give you whatever support you need, and to cheer you on, and to share the story of what you do and what you create with the rest of the world. So from Totnes in Devon on a sort of mixed, sort of cloudy, rainy, early summer day, to you in Calgary, I wish you all the very best. And we draw a lot of inspiration from what you've already done in terms of the Calgary dollars and so on, and the other work that you've already been doing. And we really hope that that those can serve as a foundation for you really being able to shift the way that the world thinks about Calgary. And we're very inspired to hear what's happening there. So thank you very much. Have a great event, and the very best wishes.